Okay, everybody. Hope you enjoyed lunch. Now, you've all probably received an email from me or heard from me over the years, but I'm Dan Morris with the School of Urban and Regional Planning. Thanks again for joining us. When Charlie and Dr. Voss and I began organizing this conference here earlier this spring after our lecture series ended, really one of our main objectives was to infuse an outside perspective into the conversation. And we were very, very fortunate that Randy Blankenhorn, the executive director of the Chicago Metropolitan Agency for Planning, agreed to come on down and speak with us. He's going to share with us his experience and knowledge on a lot of these very same issues that we've been discussing today with his experience up in the Chicago metropolitan area. So if you'd, I'm pleased to introduce now Randy Blankenhorn.
He's a little taller than I am. Thanks, Dan. I appreciate that. It's a pleasure to be here. It's an interesting time for planning. Let me tell you a little bit about myself and then a little bit about what we've done in Chicago and tell you that there is no one-size-fits-all. There is no answer that I bring from Chicago that we can just drop down in South Florida and make it work. But we did do some things a little differently, and I want to talk to you about them. My background is I actually was with the Illinois Department of Transportation for more years than I would like to admit. I was their chief of urban planning. Most of my work was in our metropolitan areas. I oversaw the work of our MPOs and of our regional planning agencies. And then we created CMAP, and I'll get into that history of how we got there, and somehow I ended up in Chicago. Chicago has a long history of planning. We were talking with Dr. Voss this morning that it's something that comes naturally to people in metropolitan Chicago. We understand architecture more than most communities. We understand the history of planning. We have Daniel Burnham as the father of planning for us and the 1909 plan. So it's a little different, but the process hasn't always worked well. When we talked about the history of how planning was done even across this country, MPOs were really created based on what we were doing in Chicago in the early 60s with the Chicago Area Transportation Study, or CATS. It's what the MPO process was built on. It was 50 years old almost when this merger happened. The Northeastern Illinois Planning Commission was 50 years old and had a history of comprehensive planning, particularly in the natural resource area, particularly in the land use area and the data collection area, of being a model for what regional commissions ought to look like on a metropolitan scale. So they really were not, they were really the kind of agencies that had a history and a past of thinking about things in a big way, of being innovative, but somehow we'd lost what we had, and it was time to do something different. There was a task force that was created by the governor of Illinois that looked at a number of things, and it was led by former Congressman Bill Lipinski, who was a high-ranking member of the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee in Congress, a long-serving congressman in Illinois, well-regarded by all of us. And it looked at a number of things, from how we fund transportation to how we do regional planning to the fact that we don't have an integrated fare card for public transit, that you use different fares for our suburban bus and rail as you do for our city bus and rail. I looked at 7 different issues. Out of those, the only thing that has come to pass has been this merger of CATS and NIPSI. And it really started there, but what happened was our local business community had been talking about this for 25 years. We have something called, it was called Metropolis 2020 at the time, the Metropolitan Planning Council, or business-led civic organizations related to the Commercial Club of Chicago, which actually developed the first plan in 1909 by Daniel Burnham. So we had this history of the business community saying we need to think about planning in an important way. And the business community for 25 years had said it doesn't make any sense for us in Chicago to do land use and natural resource planning over here and to do transportation planning over here. Doesn't make sense in today's society. And had been pushing that and pushing it and pushing it. This congressional-led delegation came out and suggested this, and so it got some momentum. I was still at DOT at the time, and we were saying, you know, maybe it is time to do things differently. The CATS was actually under the Department of Transportation. It was a state agency. Much like the creation of the MPOs here in Florida are part of county government, and the reasons are similar. That's where the local match came from. That's how we were able to fund the local part of our transportation systems. That's what made sense at the time. And so our business leaders had come to this conclusion that we needed to do something, but we started over. We started really with our local elected officials and how do we get them involved. I heard a lot about that this morning, and I think it's a key. Local elected officials have a vitally important role to play in making this happen. At the end of the day, regional planning agencies are about public policy and they're about public investments, and you need to have public sector buy-in. So we started by talking to all of our local officials. I have 286 municipalities, 7 counties, 1,400 units of government, by far the most units of government in the country. We're easy to create governments in northeastern Illinois. So it really started as a bottom-up approach. How do we get local officials, how do we get the business community, how do we get our civic organizations to buy into this concept of planning in a different way, planning more comprehensively, planning on a larger scale. We went to the General Assembly, and Illinois is not known for its easy working legislature, among other things. But for the first time in a long time, in our opinion, they did something right. The legislation that they created didn't give us a lot of requirements. It said, create this agency, create this board, you go back and figure out how you're going to make it work and come back to us on what you need. Very unusual in Illinois that it happens that way, but in my opinion, the only way it was going to be successful. If the legislature drove this process, then it wouldn't be happening today. It really happened at the local level. So they created a structure which has its own interesting facts. We have a 15-member board for a regional planning agency that's relatively small. Our board is made up of 5 members from the city of Chicago, 5 members from suburban Cook County, which is the immediate county of Chicago, and then 5 from what we call the collar counties. That's basically our population distribution, a third in the city of Chicago, a third in suburban Cook, and a third in the collars. The more interesting thing is the makeup of the board. Almost all regional planning boards across the country, or most, are almost all elected officials, and ours are not. There's no requirement for any elected officials. Right now we have about 9 of our 15 members are elected officials. The other 6 are from the civic and business community. We think that's an important perspective to bring to the table. We get completely different questions as a staff from our board members that are from local government as opposed to our board members that are from business and civic. Neither is right or wrong. They're just looking at things from a different point of view, and a very important point of view. The other thing that we created in the legislation was that I have to have 12 votes out of 15 to pass anything. Super majority, including the minutes. So it means we have to have 15 people there every month. But I think there was a reason for that. The reason was that they wanted people to be thinking regionally and not parochially, that you couldn't have the city of Chicago and the collar counties beating up on suburban Cook or vice versa, that we all had to think about this together. We have not yet had a vote in the 6 years of our existence that has not met that threshold. And I think there's a good reason for it, that we like to think in this way. The other unique thing is that our MPO policy committee still exists, the old MPO policy committee. The reason primarily was that as we created this agency, there are rules for who has to be on an MPO. State DOTs, transit providers, local officials that are responsible for transportation. We didn't want this to be a transportation board. And so we kept the MPO alive. There's a joint agreement about how things happen. They both have to approve plans and programs and policies that are related to transportation. The appointing authorities are almost identical. The staff is the same. We don't actually foresee there ever being a problem, but to get around this federal law of who had to be on an MPO board, we decided to keep it as a committee. The committee structure itself was really important, I think. We created right away what we called working committees, and we tell people we called them working committees for a reason. They're made up of people that are invested in the various subject areas that we're trying to deal with. We have a natural resources committee, an economic development committee, a transportation committee, and so on, housing. And we brought experts in the field from government and non-government onto these committees to help us develop policies and to review the staff work that's being done. Getting that investment by all of those groups in this process, I think, was vitally important. The other thing we did was try to create a direct connection with those working committees to our board. And so we've created what we call two different coordinating committees, one that deals with local policy, one that deals with regional policy. And we have members of our board and the chair or vice chair of each of those working committees that sit together every month and talk about those issues together. So it's not just the working committees feeling like they just work with the staff. They have that direct access to our board of directors, which really makes their work more worthwhile. So at the beginning of this, the question, and I think the question that you raised today, is why? Why create CMAP? Why create a new agency? What's the benefit? I can tell you that for us, it was very strictly that we understand we are one economic region. It isn't Chicago against our suburbs and fights for jobs. It's Chicago against Brazil and China and India, and we need to think that way. And our local elected officials, our business leaders, our civic organizations get that. That doesn't mean that they're not fighting for the Walmart on the corner every once in a while or the new car dealership. They do. That's a tax problem that I might get into later if I have time. But they really do understand that if we're going to make this work, that it's about being one economic region, and we need to think in that regional context. We need to plan comprehensively in a bigger way, and that's the feeling that they had, that we were not going to succeed as that economic region unless we planned for a 21st century metropolitan Chicago. We believe there are going to be a handful, pick a number, a dozen, truly global metropolitan regions that can compete in a global economy. Chicago is there today. The question is, will it be there tomorrow? And that's what our local elected officials and our business community have said. This is what we need to be doing, and this is what we need to be thinking about, and this is what really draws us together. We don't have land use control. We don't want land use control. We don't think that's our job. I have 286 municipalities. I don't want to do parcel-based zoning in all of those communities. That's not what we want to do. But we do want to make sure that our local governments are thinking about things in a different way. And this is, again, the importance of involving and engaging them. We tell them when you have your meetings on Monday nights, which are our Plan Commission and council meetings usually, we want you to think about the impact of the decisions you're making. We want you to think about the impacts on your neighbors, the impacts on our economic vitality, the impact on our natural resources, the impact on our transportation system. Think about what those decisions are doing and how you're making them. We're not telling you how to make them, but think about the impacts of those decisions. When we looked at how we might move this forward, we looked, and I think this is part of the conversation this morning, is what is the role of the MPO? And I think it's an important role that you all have to think about. MPOs have a structure in place. More importantly, they have financing in place. They are the only place the federal government puts any money for planning. And I think they're the building block for a decision on how you move forward in dealing with regional issues. Having said that, MPOs that just do transportation planning don't make any sense to me. We need to be able to bring that together. We need to be able to think about transportation in a much more strategic way inside of the comprehensive solutions that we need to look at in our communities. When I was at Illinois DOT, I was on the plane with the secretary one day, and I had just gotten done saying in a speech that he was sitting in the audience at that transportation was not a goal, that it was a strategy for other things. And I wasn't sure I was going to be able to get back on the plane when I said that, but it's the truth. Transportation investments create strategies for other things that are based on how we build jobs and how we build strong communities. And that's really where I think you need to think about what is the role of the MPO, how do you combine that with the comprehensive planning issues that you're dealing with, and how do you think about it geographically in a different way. One of the first requirements of GO-TO 2040 was to create, or of CMAP, was to create a plan. It's called GO-TO 2040. I think all of you have copies of the short version. I wouldn't ask anybody to read the long version. It's 400 and some pages. But what we really tried to do was think about this in two ways. When I tell people what the plan is about, it's about two things. It's about economic prosperity, and it's about strengthening our communities. And that is all that it's about. Every program, every policy, every recommendation in the plan deals with economic prosperity and strengthening our communities. The other thing that's different about this plan is that it's a strategic implementation plan. It's not a vision. The vision was done earlier in the process, and I will talk a little bit about that process, but it is not just a vision. The long version talks about each of the 148 implementation strategies and says who needs to be involved, where's the funding going to come from, who leads, who follows, if it's not for us, what is the role of the region, if it's a federal decision that needs to be made, where do we play and how do we make it happen. We think this was incredibly important as a plan to take that next step that a lot of regional planning agencies simply don't do, and they don't think it's their job, and that's okay. But from our perspective and from our business community's perspective, their buy-in was dependent on implementation, and I think that's where we needed to go with that. The third piece that makes it different is really the comprehensive nature of the plan. All plans talk about transportation. They talk about land use. Most of them talk about environment and natural resources. They may talk about a few other things. We start by talking about education. And we're the only plan in America that talks about education. And it's because our board felt very strongly that if we don't do a better job of educating our children, it doesn't really matter what else we do. That we can no longer be 130th in math and science in the world and think we're going to get ahead. We need to talk about how we give all of our children a better chance and how we bring kids along into tomorrow's workers and tomorrow's civic leaders. Having said that, we are not experts in education. That's not what we do for a living. And part of the process that I'll talk about was we brought in experts that did. Arne Duncan, the current Secretary of Education at USDOE, served on our task force before he was called to Washington. Our higher education task force was led by the Chancellor of the University of Illinois. We brought in the right people to have the right conversations to come up with the right solutions. And I think that was an important thing for us to do. It, again, builds that buy-in that we were trying to get. We talk about tax policy. When we brought this issue up, most of our partners said we were crazy. Many of our local governments said, what does this have to do with you? Why are you bringing this up? At the end of the day, tax policy drives development decisions. We have the kind of of residential development we have because property taxes pay for our schools in Illinois. We have the kind of retail development we have because sales tax are the biggest drivers of our local government economy. And so the question that we asked was, are we incenting the right things through our tax code? We weren't talking about whether or not we raise taxes or lower taxes. That's for elected officials to decide. But did the system make sense? And again, not being experts, we brought in 15 people from academia, from business, from local government to talk about what this is. And it was an incredibly hard conversation. I was asked throughout the process what I thought would come of it, and I said, I don't know, but it's been really fun to watch. It's really difficult. We got called a lot of names when we talked about how should we share sales tax differently. We are a winner-take-all system in Illinois. You get 100% of the retail value of sales tax. And as we looked at other methods, people said, well, you're creating winners and losers. Our goal is not to create winners and losers in anything we do, but the fact is the system already creates winners and losers. Does that system make any sense? So we talked about those kinds of things. We talked about human capital. We think, again, that's so important, not just in the education side, but in workforce. We believe that we in Illinois, in a lot of ways, are still training for yesterday's jobs, not even today's jobs, and certainly not tomorrow's jobs. The system is incredibly complex. Business can't figure out how to use the workforce development system in Illinois. There's no way an individual can. It's not flexible. It doesn't meet the needs of our workers. On the panel today, they were talking about jobs that are open. Everywhere I go, there are high-tech manufacturing jobs open in metropolitan Chicago that we can't fill. That's a shame, and we need to do something about it, and this plan tries to deal with some of that. We talk about innovation, and this was a hard thing for us. As we talked about innovation, people said, well, we need an innovation czar. We need an innovation committee. Chicago, the Midwest, was really on the forefront of economic innovation for centuries, and we've lost that. We've lost it to the coasts, and how do we bring that back? My position was innovation is a private sector endeavor that is supported by government and not the other way around. That if you put innovation in a government box, it cannot possibly be innovation. That we have to support more research at our universities, we have to support more research in the private sector, and we've got to a certain extent get out of the way. And I think that's where we feel innovation has to happen and our role in it. Let me talk just a little bit about this whole process of creating this plan. We talked about the visioning. Honestly, the visioning was pretty easy for us. We have a planning history, and it was, people pretty much agreed where we wanted to go. Is really the strategic, how do we get there, that mattered. So the visioning process, we ended up with dozens of meetings. This morning people are talking about, and I think, Michael, you talked about the fact that, people trust government leaders to think about their future, that they don't have time. I encountered that every day. I probably had 250 different meetings over the course of this, and trying to get people to think long term is really, really hard. But when we asked people to think about what kind of community they wanted for their children, what kind of community they wanted for their grandchildren, people actually care very deeply about it. And we're willing to talk about it. You just have to get them out of that mindset of, am I going to have a job tomorrow? How am I going to send my kids to school? And get them to think a little more broadly, because they have great ideas and they care so strongly. It's getting that out of them that is hard, and that's what we tried to do with our processes. Another piece of it was research. We did over 60 white papers on various issues, from parking policy to clean water, in a way for our elected officials and our business leaders to understand the ramifications of the decisions that they make. One of the ones that I use all the time is transit-oriented development. There's not a plan in America that doesn't talk about transit-oriented development. What the heck does it mean? It means something different everywhere. And what we tried to do with our paper was to say, if you develop in this way around transit stations, here's the kind of additional access you'll get for workers. Here's how the housing market can work differently. Here's how economic activity will change. And really put that spin on it of, it's not just talking about TOD, it's talking about the results of TOD. And that's what those research papers were really meant to do, was to set the stage for that. The outreach was different as well. We met with over 35,000 people to talk through this. 35,000 out of 8 million in Chicago maybe doesn't sound like a lot, but it's about 30,000 more than we ever talked to before. So it was a huge step for us. And we did it in ways that were interactive. We worked with this company that created what's called MetroQuest, where we would get groups of people together and talk to them about what they cared about, what was most important to them. If you made this kind of a decision, if you made this kind of an investment, they could see immediately what that meant. If we made this kind of an investment in transportation or in transit, here's what it would mean to growth. Here's what it would mean to compact neighborhoods. Here's what it would mean to the attractiveness to business. And so people were able to see right away that, well, I can see the trade-offs in all the decisions that we make every day, that you and I make every day, and how those trade-offs come into play. And we thought that was important as well. You can't have everything. And so the trade-offs that you make in investments and the trade-offs that you make in public policy, we were able to really show them right up front. The other thing that I want to say was this process was about building ownership. At the end of the day, if it's just CMAP's plan, it's a really nice colored book with really pretty pictures and graphics in it, but that's all it is. This was about building ownership. The business community had to own this, our elected officials had to own this, the public had to own this, and they have to a big extent, and it's because they were involved in the decision making. We often say this wasn't our plan at all, that we were simply the scribes that wrote down what other people were thinking and what other people's goals and visions were, and tried to put that in a way that we could sell it across metropolitan Chicago. It's also all about leadership. I heard that a couple times this morning, and I cannot say the word leadership to you enough. For us, the leadership came significantly from the business community, but it came significantly from our elected officials as well, that thought we needed to think differently and do things differently. If you don't create that, if you have a leadership vacuum here, nothing will happen. You will have extremely good ideas that don't move forward. It is 100% about leadership. Michael said it. Good plans and bad leaders can't happen, and bad plans can actually work with good leadership. And so I think that you need to figure that part out for yourselves of who leads, how we get that together, how we get to a point where our leaders care about this in a way that makes sense. So what was the bottom line for us as we looked at this creation of CMAP? I think that it came from the fact that our problems are regional. Our problems are metropolitan in scale, and so are yours. Whether you want to admit it or not, they are. Transportation, water, environment, housing, these are regional issues. States are too big, cities are too small. These are metropolitan in scale, and if they are metropolitan problems, then the answers have to be regional in nature, and that's what our leaders believe. We believe that regions geographically should be defined economically. What is the economic region? But don't tie yourselves to thinking too much into what is the geography. You have to start somewhere to a certain extent. Even our economic region actually goes into southern Wisconsin and into northwest Indiana, and they are their own agencies. We have limitations as you do. So don't get caught up too much in it. There's a different region for housing than there is for water, than there is for transportation. We've tried to focus on that economic region that ties them all together. The process has to be driven locally. It can't be driven top-down. It has to be led by business and local government. It has to be the kind of a system that people here believe in and own. But there has to be a role for the state. States have an important role in planning, and I don't think they always realize that. I know in Illinois they don't always realize it, and today they're not realizing it very much at all. When we were created, we actually went to the Speaker and got dedicated funding passed, which was nice. The funding automatically went from the general revenue account into the Comprehensive Regional Planning Fund. It couldn't be used for anything else. The problem was for the past 3 years they haven't appropriated it, so it doesn't really help us any. But at least it's there. At least at one time the thinking at the state level, at one time the thinking at the state level was we need to be a player in this conversation. I still think they do. Thankfully for us, Illinois DOT, maybe it's because of my close relationship from them in the past, has stepped forward and given us matched the funding that the state would have given us. The problem with that is it's transportation money. Not that we're against any kind of money, but it's hard to do housing work with transportation money. And so we really are going to continue to look for different ways to do that. I talked about using the MPOs as a starting point, a jumping off point. I don't know that it's necessarily the ending point, but I think it's part of this. It's part of the jumping off point. I think that it's interesting in here. There's already relationships between the comprehensive regional planning agencies like Michael and Jim and the MPOs. It's not that these people aren't talking already. They are. It's not that the MPOs up and down the coast aren't talking already. They are. It's how much are they talking, how much of their vision is shared, how much of the work can be done more efficiently in a different way. Those are the kinds of questions that I think you need to be answering. But the fact is, we were able to use investments in infrastructure as that leverage to bring things together. I'm not trying to get Michael to be the guy that was right this morning on where you need to focus. But Chicago was built on infrastructure, transportation infrastructure in particular. It is the reason we exist. It is our global economic advantage, and we simply weren't, and still aren't to a certain extent, investing enough in it. And so it became this rallying point where we can use the MPO process if we merge it with another agency and create something new where we have the transportation hammer to be able to do some of the other things that we want to do. And that's what we've done. We have the authority not only for federal funds by law, but by practice for state funds that come into our region have to be in our approved programs. And we've gone through a phase where, in the past, the MPO would take everybody's program and staple it together, and then it would be a regional program. We've taken that role a little more seriously and said, we are going to think about what is the best infrastructure investments for metropolitan Chicago, and that's what we're going to fund. And that means it's a change for our implementers. It's a change for our transit agencies. It's a change for our state DOT. A couple of the biggest transit projects that were in the planning process, we didn't put in our plan. So we simply didn't think they were a cost-effective way to do it. We believe strongly in transit. In fact, call for significantly more transit investment. It just wasn't in these projects. Some of the point of CMAP is that we were created to take that political heat. The transit agencies didn't necessarily like these projects all that much themselves, but they couldn't say no. We could, and we did. And I think that they appreciate the fact that we were able to make that move. You talked this morning about best practices, and I think this is an important piece that we've tried to do, is on our website and through the work that we do, we've created two different kinds of blogs. One is a policy blog that talks about whatever is happening in the region. Almost daily there is something new on there that we send out not only across the region but across the country to talk about what we're doing. The other is a best practices blog, which I think is incredibly important for local governments. No offense to our friends in Portland, but we are not Portland in Chicago, and we are never going to be Portland. And in fact, we don't actually want to be Portland. What we want to be is Metropolitan Chicago, and there are incredibly good things happening, and we need to let people know that they are. We need to let people know that you can have an ordinance that requires less downtown parking, and it still works. We need to have a place where you can do water retrieval differently, and it still works and doesn't flood your streets. We need to have local governments be able to look to their neighbors and see that makes sense for me. I can see it here. I can actually go visit it if I want to. I can talk to somebody that's done it. And so we think that's just a really, really important piece. The other is, I heard this a couple of different times today, and that is the trusted place. I think it's important that trusted place be created. And I think to a large extent that trusted place has become CMAP. People trust us for policy work. They trust us on our technical assistance. They trust us that we have the best interest of the region over the long term at heart. And if you don't have that, then it's going to be hard for local government and it's going to be hard for business to buy in to what you're trying to do. It doesn't happen overnight. I told this story to one of our friends back here that one of our business-led groups, the Metropolitan Planning Council, the chairman of their board in their last budget cycle said, everything that we're doing in our work program has to support the implementation of GO-TO 2040. If it doesn't, we're not doing it anymore. That's the kind of support that you need from business. That's the kind of support you need from your civic organizations. And it happens because they trust us. We don't have a political agenda. We don't have a winners and losers agenda. What we try to do is put things in the context of what is best over the long term in this region. We are where we are today because of decisions that were made 15, 20, and 30 years ago. For good or bad, that's where we are. And we need to make better decisions today to impact what's going to happen 10 or 15 or 20 years from now. And that's where we have tried to become that very important trusted place that I think you're trying to create here as well. I guess at the end, when we think about what's new, what's next, how do you move forward, I'll say a couple of things. First is that I don't believe that you can think about doing something different without taking a leap of faith. It has to happen. You have to believe that you can make a difference. You have to believe that the decisions that are going to come out of this, the investments that are going to come out of this, are better for the region, for the metropolitan region. Secondly, I don't think you have to throw away institutions to make that change. You might, but you don't have to. I think you need to think very strategically about what's working and what's not working, about the relationships that are built and about the relationships that need to be built. Having said that, I think you need to think much more geographically bigger than you are today. You need to think about a metropolitan region in a new and unique way. A region, again, no offense to Jim and Michael, to me, a county is not a region. A county is a county. And you need to think about how to make that work. Does that mean you have to create one huge 7-county regional agency? No, absolutely not. But I think you need to think about it differently. When I, just walking around last night and talking to people today, there doesn't seem to be that sense of metropolitan area here. And how do you create that sense? You're, to a certain extent, you're a community of people that grew up somewhere else. And how do you create a sense of greater Miami or greater South Florida or greater whatever you want to call it? I think that's important, but it takes that leap of faith that this is good for us, and it takes bringing together and rallying around something that matters to all of you. And what matters to all of you is the economic future of our children. How do we think about that in a new and different way? Third, you have to think more comprehensively. There's no demand that MPOs and regional planning agencies be merged, but you have to work together. You have to think about how this transportation investments create a stronger community and better economic activity. It has to be in the context of something bigger than a transportation plan. It's interesting, when we created our transportation plan, if you look at this document, there is no chapter that says transportation plan. The transportation is a part of everything that we've done inside of it, and we've tried to make it that way and keep it that way, and that's really the way that we try to create the agency. When we created the legislation, it actually called for me to hire a deputy director for transportation and a deputy director for comprehensive planning. I just ignored that. That didn't make any sense to me. We're trying to pull these things together, and they were trying to pull them apart at the staff level. And so we have a director of planning, and we have a director of research, and we have things that made sense to us to look at from a much more holistic standpoint than we do today. The fourth, I guess, is that business has to care. I can't say this enough. Business has to care. It's not going to be enough for well-minded executive directors of your agencies to say we need to do something different. It has to be business-led, and then the local elected officials have to believe that there's something in it for them. They're elected every 4 years, at least in Illinois every 4 years. And their long-range planning is that next election. That's as far as it goes. And so we need to figure out a way to make sure that they understand that this is in their community's best interest, and it's in their personal best interest to think about it from a regional perspective. And that's hard. It does take, again, I'll go back to that leap of faith by our elected officials that the sum is bigger than the parts, and it truly is. Finally, I guess I would talk about just how you make this happen. It was difficult for us. This is not something that happened over a one-year legislative cycle. It took a lot of time. It took a lot of work. It took the right moment in time to a certain extent. It took a governor who was willing to talk about things differently at a regional level. It took a leader in Congressman Lipinski that was able to put this issue on the table. And it took a business community that said the time is ripe, let's go. But I think that being patient is in none of our best interests. I think being patient and waiting and talking, I think maybe the time is over for that. It certainly was for us, and I think maybe it is for you. You need to see concrete action. You need to see concrete results, even if they are steps, even if it's not all at once, even if you're making strides to where you want to go. You need to make those strides, and you need to be able to show that they work. You need to be able to convince the public. You need to be able to convince others that this makes sense to you. At the end of the day, it's about those better investments. It's about that stronger community. It's about the way we build our neighborhoods. It's about the way we support economic development and economic activity. I believe, and maybe this is because it's what I do for a living, but I believe regions are where important decisions are going to be made in the future. When we look at what's happening in Washington, if they ever can make a decision again, it will be a miracle. At the state levels, there simply aren't the resources to do everything there needs to be done. We need to think about solutions at the regional level, and that includes investing in ourselves. In Chicago, we already tax ourselves for operations for our transit system on a regional scale. We need to think about how we're doing that for other things. We're talking, for those of you that have read, Mayor Emanuel has initiated an infrastructure investment fund for the city. One of the things that they talked about to us was, how is that going to work? Because I know you want to think about this from a regional scale. And we said, well, you can try it, and we'll see if it works for you. But I think it fits into how we invest in ourselves, how we raise funds locally and regionally to solve our problems, because the days of money raining down on us from Springfield, in our case, in Tallahassee, in your case, and from Washington are over. And so we need to think about how that is. And the only way you make that happen is to have the kind of business plan that Keith talked about and that Joe talked about, and how we think about implementing that vision plan locally. With that, I am much more interested in having a conversation with these guys about what we're trying to do, how we've done it, and how you think about moving this forward, because honestly, I think not moving it forward is not an answer. I think there has to be a solution, and it may be incremental, but you have to move away from where you are today. So with that, thank you, and I look forward to it. Yes. Yeah, I'll take questions. Pardon me? We do. We think, I tell people all the time that one of the ways that you tell if you are a metropolitan region is if you're on vacation and you live in the suburbs and people ask where you're from and you say Chicago, that's how you're identified. And I think that's a little bit of your problem here is you don't have that main identification. The creation of our plan, when we announced the plan, we had at Millennium Park, the new downtown park that Mayor Daley built, a celebration for a plan that is over a 30-year horizon, and we had 1,000 people there. If you would have told me I would have had 50 when we started this process, I would have been impressed. And so there is a sense already that we are that metropolitan area. The other part that was helpful for us is that we came on the 100th anniversary of Daniel Burnham's Plan of Chicago. It's 1909, 2009 was the 100th anniversary. Our plan came out in 2010, so we were able to use a lot of the momentum of the celebration. In fact, when I first started in the job, I had a meeting with the celebration folks, and I said, your plan comes out a year later, how does that make you feel? I said, it makes me a little nervous that you think we're writing the next plan of Chicago. And they said, that is what we expect. We don't claim to be Daniel Burnham, but we really tried to live on in that legacy, and I think the celebration around the 100th anniversary really played well into the timing of the creation of our plan. So I don't know how you want this to go.
Let me grab your phone for a second. Instead of me moderating, I actually think it's much more interesting to ask the panel for a response and then just to have a discussion that I just sit down and leave you guys to that. I'll just stand up. And stop.
Well, yeah, when you want us to stop, just let me know. I'll give you a right there. So I got off my prepared remarks today because you guys said such interesting things this morning that I wasn't even sure where to take this discussion. So I'm interested in your thoughts on what I said and how we move, if you move in a new direction.
I'll maybe start as a long-time Chicago resident. I lived in Chicago for
of course you are.
20 years. Yeah, 20 years. I went to Northwestern for grad school. I was a planning director in the Chicago area, so I have a little bit of an understanding of what happens in that metropolitan area. One question I actually have of you is, with the way your organization is structured, other than the distribution of the MPO money, what teeth do you have, and what the follow-up to that after you answer that portion would be, so, in the areas that you don't have teeth, how are you able to be effective?
Yeah, we have really two sets of teeth, and one is the transportation funds, and like I said, we take that seriously, and I think it's important that we do. It's all MPOs have this. Very few MPOs flex any muscle in using the transportation funds in that way. The second is that the General Assembly created something called Projects of Regional Significance. That's not right, but they changed the name. Developments of Regional Importance that have to go through
DRI.
DRI.
It's everywhere.
Yeah.
Can't get away from it.
Yeah, and what it said was that we had review over certain that were truly regional in nature. We're talking about when we were talking about the Olympics in Chicago, that's a DRI. Not a shopping center, not a, and we were actually able to define that. It was, again, one of the things the legislature did right is said, we want you to do something. We don't want you to say yes or no. That's not our job. We want you to make them better in a short time, because time is money. We had actually ULI led the work on defining the regulations that we created for this because we wanted to work with the development community to do something that worked in their time frame. So that's the good news. The bad news is the way we define developments of regional importance in this economy, we have not had one yet. So we don't know if it works. we're actually hoping to do a DRI. The other piece of it is that we got a HUD grant as well, and you heard a little bit of talk about that this morning, and ours was to implement the plan. It was interesting. In that event that I was talking about at Millennium Park where we announced a plan, Senator Durbin, our senior senator, was one of the speakers. And he said, Randy, do you have a minute? I need to talk to you. And I said, well, I got to go introduce Mayor Daley. And he said, well, just give me 1 minute. I think you'll like it. He said, you're going to get a call this afternoon. You're going to get $4.5 million to start to implement the plan. So that was worth taking 15 seconds. That's HUD money. But what we did with it is completely different than what most other people is that what we did was we hired 10 expert staff in various capacities: economic development, planning, natural resources, housing, and we are embedding them in communities to implement the things that they think are important in our plan. We're doing this for two reasons. One is local governments are going to be the biggest implementer of our plan, and we want them to do it right. The second is it built this trust that I was talking about. If they trust us on the on the technical assistance issues, if we can get a foot in our door and they understand that we're not out there to do something bad to them, we were out there to help them, it helps us with our policy work. They seem to trust us more on the policy side because they can trust us on the on the technical assistance side. We thought when this was a non-government type of program. The application was 1 page. It said, what's your problem? What do you want to do about it? What can CMAP do to help? We thought we might get 30 or 40 applications. We got 280. Wow. We have 60 of those underway. So we've tried to use getting in the communities and, again, not doing work from our offices in Sears Tower, but embedding people in communities for 3-4 months at a time so that they feel that ownership of it. That's one of the ways we're trying to implement the plan. The other. The truth is that we are a planning agency, and we don't have zoning authority. As I said, we don't want it. We don't have that kind of authority. It's about our ability to make people think differently.
Do you charge for that technical assistance?
We do not. When the HUD grant runs out, we might have to. But at this point in time, we don't. And in fact, our goal is to never to have to charge for it.
One of the things, my question is, I heard trusted place. It seemed to me that the white papers, the policy white papers, the fact-based decision-making that you were able to do on those white papers is an important piece of how you got there. Were those funded with MPO or transportation dollars? How did those get to be created and get to be the independent voice for the trusted place?
They were funded in a couple of ways. Anything that we can tie to transportation for funding, we do. And our DOT to a certain extent has been lenient would be too strong a word, but understanding that as long as we can show that transportation tie, we can use transportation money. The groups that I told you that came in to talk about education or things that we don't have specific expertise on, they did that for free. The Chicago Community Trust, one of our philanthropic partners, funded the staff work on when we needed to bring expert staff in, but all of those, the dozens and dozens and dozens of high-level experts that sat on those oversight groups did it for free. We had an incredible partner in the Chicago Community Trust, which is one of our biggest philanthropies in town. From the beginning, their goal was to help promote CMAP and the plan, and so we did get significant amounts of funding in plan development from the trust.
And how long did it take for the trusted place to evolve? Was it 2 years, 5 years, 10?
Yeah, well, I would say it never is done evolving.
Okay.
There are still people that I would guess that if you walk around my 286 communities and ask not so much mayors, but aldermen, how many of them know who CMAP is, you'll get less than 50%. So I don't think it's ever over. I think when we were able to deal with not only the white papers that we did and the real research end of it, but the fact that we brought so many people inside the process to create the plan, I think that's when we became the trusted place. That's when they felt ownership of CMAP.
Okay.
Yeah.
Question on how is CMAP's relationship with the transit operators? I mean, there's a huge regional transportation operation issue in Chicago. do they have to be consistent with the plan? Do you just have some relationship with them that they, you're working together? Because they have some ideas too about how the transit system should
Right.
be built and then operated. How do you guys deal with
Yeah.
that?
No, are there reporters in this room?
I don't know.
No, okay.
I wouldn't worry.
Two things. One is that, yes, the transit projects have to be in our program. And, so they're not doing anything that we haven't approved. We have a system where we have 3 operating agencies: PACE, our suburban bus; Metro, our intercity rail; and then CTA, which does city bus and rail. Over that, there's what's called the Regional Transportation Authority, which does financial oversight and planning. We are the MPO. So there's all these levels. Why I asked if there's reporters is that the business group that was very much in charge of creating us on Friday called for a merger of CMAP and the RTA.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that's an evolution, I think.
It's the next evolution in planning. We're not sure if we like it yet or not. But I think my reaction on Friday was that we do planning and financial oversight. They do planning and financial oversight. Is this duplicative? I mean, isn't there a way we can do this more efficiently? Maybe it'll work, maybe it won't. But I think it's worth looking at. The truth is, our transit operators, because we're the MPO, would prefer to work through us. They feel more hamstrung by the RTA than they do for us. We are doing significant technical assistance for them on projects. The biggest project in our plan on the CTA is the extension of the red line on the south side of the city. We're doing all the land use planning around that for them. When we created the plan, we went in and said, this is our priority, and they said, okay, then it'll be ours too. When the new mayor came in, he said, okay, this is our priority, is the red line.
I'm just out of comment. You're describing a model, at least I'm sorry, that the regional planning councils, to a certain extent, have begun to sort of model themselves after. Is we most of the work in our last 5 years, and frankly, most of our funding has come from the transportation organizations like Joe's, and we're forever grateful, and also, but the MPOs and the FDOTs, they were missing that planning function, especially when it gets related to around stations and convincing towns and cities that, you can't have like 1 unit to the acre inside your city next to the biggest train station in the region. So, and we've, again, built, I think, a very large constituency for that successfully. So it's just not, it's not formalized other than with, an annual or a biannual contract. Yeah. And by the way, we do charge for those services because nobody else is paying. So.
Yeah,
Okay.
and I think that's
it's interesting. It's interesting. It's just not formal.
I think it's important that you have this, and when I was one of the people that helped write the legislation that created CMAP when I was still at the state. And my standard joke here is that if I would have known I was going to be executive director, I would have written it a lot differently.
But you always write it that way.
Yeah, but I think that the issue for us was how do we take Katz and Nipsey, which when people said they never talk to each other. Katz and Nipsey were the transportation and the plan and the comprehensive. Yeah, we talked about calling it catnip when we got done the new agency. That they weren't talking to each other, which simply wasn't true. They were. Was it as good as it is now? Absolutely not. But to say that there wasn't cooperation, there wasn't coordination, isn't true. It's how do you need to formalize it? Number one, and maybe you do, and maybe you don't. But number two, it's what's the results that you're looking for, and are you getting the results you want under the structure you have now? And if you're not, what needs to change?
I was going to say that I would agree with you, particularly on the standpoint that you find a way to make it work, and if it's working, you encourage that. But it is so much better if you are able to put it under a bought-into oversight that will encourage that continuity. The question I had for you was, I liked your comment on innovation, and that you support that the research is done by the university sector and the private sector. what's your buy-in from them? How do they get their information to you? Because I fully agree, but I'm wondering, how do you get that reporting relationship to work with you?
Yeah, it's again, we are a relatively new agency, and so it's always a work in progress. What we've done is with World Business Chicago, which is our outreach, our economic outreach organization, and the Chicagoland Chambers created an innovation index. And what this has done is brought the universities and the private sector in and talking about what are we measuring, how are we measuring it. And so it was this first kind of almost academic step in the door that then gets them engaged in the conversation about how we move this research agenda along. How do we think about venture capital? I tell people all the time, I'm not all that concerned that we're behind Boston and Silicon Valley in venture capital. I'm a little unhappy that we're behind Minneapolis. And what do we need to do about that? And so it was taking this kind of academic index that I think you might be talking about in the next session, the indexing part of it, and then bringing them into, okay, here's what we're measuring, here's how we're doing, now how do we move the needle, and how do we move that needle together?
I have a question for you. This would be advice, from you. In Chicago, I mean, you got a veritable who's who of. You spoke about private sector involvement. You got a veritable, unbelievable, lengthy list of huge corporations that have headquarters there, that have deep, talented executive pools that have been highly involved in the community and civic institutions, in many cases for generations. I mean, Abbott Labs, Baxter, Allstate, Motorola. I mean, the list just goes on and on, Aon. It's like you probably have 30 or 40 Fortune 500s based in the city of Chicago.
Just downtown, right?
Just downtown. You look at the suburbs, and it's probably, you might have, 10 or 15% of the Fortune 500s in the Chicago metropolitan area based. We don't have that.
Right.
Okay, I mean, we have Carnival. We have a few. Okay, we maybe have 3 or 4 in South Florida. So what would you tell us about how we have tons of small businesses, okay, tourism and real estate based, not necessarily manufacturing based. So how do we do that? How do we get more business involvement, meaningful business involvement? Now, we do have lots of regional headquarters, all those companies and more, international ones as well. Is maybe an opportunity, I don't know. But
I think there are opportunities. I mean, the truth is that having the big corporate presence that we do in Chicago, and honestly having a tradition of civic engagement by those corporate partners is incredibly, we're incredibly lucky that we have it. Almost no other city in America has what we have in that way. Even New York and LA that have more Fortune 500s don't have that history of civic engagement. You heard from Barb Yarrow about it, I think, at one of your earlier meetings. Having said that, I think you can't go, it's hard to go to the small guys. There's just so many of them. And so I think that if I was you, what I would do is focus on medium-sized firms with real growth potential and say, if you want to invest in your business, in this community, then you have to help us design what this community looks like. You have to care about where your workers are going to come from. You had a conversation earlier this morning about tomorrow's worker. Tomorrow's worker is very different than today's. It looks different. He and she looks different. They act different. They don't want to drive. They want to be close to transit. They want to be in places that are much more dense, where there's activities going on. They want parks in their neighborhood. They don't want to have to drive 60 miles to a park that's really nice and really big. They want something they can walk their kids to. And so I think that when business thinks about what their worker of tomorrow is, it means they've got to think about what their community looks like tomorrow. And if they're going to grow their business, they have to grow it together. And I think that's a selling point for medium-sized businesses. And I think that's where I would try to focus.
Yeah, clearly, if you don't have the conversation going on, first of all, the conversation has to start in the public-private sector, specifically in the educators and the job creators. And then what we're seeing in Palm Beach County is the conversation with the public education construct, with the STEM programs, on down to conversations about charter high schools for software engineers, so that you can actually build a supply. Because when I talk to CEOs, they say, I need this job filled today. So, okay, fine, but what about if we give you a supply that you can count on starting next year? And the problem is getting the education, the academic sector to go, okay, I'm on board. I'll start delivering that, even if I have to do a certificate. Would you accept a certificate program rather than something that's got to go through the educational construct that takes 4 years to be able to become a degreed program? That's what I need now. This is exactly what I need. So that the employers have to tell the educators what they need. The educators have to try to meet that need within the boundaries of what they can do. And that's a different dynamic. And that conversation is just starting to happen, but it's not happening on a regular basis. Is happening ad hoc.
Yeah, and I think that's really important. I talked in the remarks about the workforce training, and at least in Chicago, how I feel we're not doing a very good job of it. It has to be business-led. We're working with our community colleges. We have a great community college system in metropolitan Chicago. Beyond the wonderful, universities, we have a very good, but they're all single-minded campuses. They think about themselves, and we're trying to get them to think as a system. That does every one of your universities need a nursing training program? Can that go here, here, and here? Can we look at logistics training at this one and this one? How can we think about it in a way that's more efficient and makes more sense and can get more people through that system quickly? We are all about measuring success at CMAP, and one of my biggest concerns when we look at the workforce system was there is no measurement of success. People can tell me how many people went into a program. Almost all of them can tell me.
Mm-hmm.
Some can tell me who left with a degree or certificate. Some. Almost nobody can tell me if that led to a job. We need to be able to measure success in a way that we can then build on that.
Would you repeat that again?
It's all about that bottom line. Did this result in an employment opportunity for somebody?
Because
are we training to create those employment opportunities for jobs that actually exist?
And I think the educators are, because of the budget cuts, and I'm not picking on you guys here, but I think what's happened is that there is a profitability measurement that's happening now because, the doc college that FAU just started, with the cost to educate a doc is probably triple what the revenue is coming in. So the revenues have to come from somewhere. So they're coming from maybe archaeology or something that maybe is a lower cost construct. But it's not producing the same impact on our local society. It maybe is creating an impact in Arizona or Utah, but it's not creating an impact here. So, that's one of the things that as you evolve the imbalance that's there to the balance that needs to happen, so that you're not looking at cuts every year. You're not looking at now corporations seeing property taxes going up and they're saying, I guess maybe I should go to Texas, because in Austin they get it. So there's different dynamics. But it's funny, I made the comment about having the matrix for governments, having best practices, and lo and behold, the young lady in the back hands me her card and said, we did it. And so just this little construct here has become very valuable to me, because I'd like to take that, the Jill, right? That Jill said, I've done that for the Broward County government. So she actually has that. So if somebody would take on the opportunity to develop what we're talking about here, so the next year when we have this conversation, we actually have results. Because I also asked her that. I said, next year when you have it, you had the first year, second year, are you going to have any results? When you get together with these different counties and communities, are you going to talk about the results? Did you go from 6 months to get a permit to 2 weeks? No, but we shortened it to a month. Good, that's a result.
Right.
So, maybe we set some action points here and some goals that would take a first step.
One of the things that we did as a part of our work here, because again, I say measurement is everything for us, is we created something called Metropolitan Chicago. And it takes 140 different issues and measures over time and compares us to other regions.
What's it called?
Metropulse Chicago. Metropulsechicago.org. And it's our way of measuring on all of these issues are we making the progress we want? It does two things. It's an overall for the community. It's very easy to use. It's got a built-in mapping device, so you can map and graph anything you want, even a beginner. But for us, it's more, we put very specific goals in our plan of where we wanted to be on these 140 issues, 5-year goals and then 20-year goals. If when we get to in between there, we're not waiting until the 5 years are up to see if we're making progress. We need to know, are we making progress where we need to be, and be able to step back and ask ourselves, if not, why not? Was the strategy wrong? Did we not invest in it correctly? What happened for us not to be able to move this? And so I think that's a key part for, I don't care where you are, in government or in business or in a regional planning agency, if you're not measuring your success towards your goals, and you have no idea if you're getting there or not, and you cannot possibly make wise investments.
Question for you. You had is there time for one more question? You had mentioned when this thing happened, the CMAP happened.
This thing.
It's a good thing. Sounds like a good thing to me.
It's a thing.
It's evolving. That the MPO, the old MPO boards, or the, you know, what they, how are they still around, or are they still around as, and how do they function, these MPOs?
Yeah. We only had one MPO for the region to start with.
Oh, jeez. All right, no fair.
So,
Don't need an answer.
All right, we got 6.
yeah, I mean, it's a
We're
totally
6 for 7 here.
it's a totally different dynamic, and I understand.
But how did you do that? How did you keep that sort of that policy discussion? You know, because they have talks about that. How did
Yeah.
you keep that alive?
Yeah, they meet quarterly.
All right.
Our CMAP board meets every month. The MPO policy committee meets quarterly. We jointly meet every October to bring them all together.
Okay. Now, what sort of advice do they give the board? I mean, CMAP. Do you take their advice as local sort of input, or is that how that kind of? Well, I guess they weren't really.
Yeah, I mean, who
Already
sits on it?
regional.
Let me just tell you who sits on our MPO board. Maybe that'll help. It's chaired by the Secretary of the State DOT.
Really?
All 6 county engineers are
Huh.
members.
This is the voting board, the
Yeah.
CMAP?
Yeah, no, of the MPO policy.
Oh, the policy.
The MPO
Okay.
policy.
Okay, I get it.
The Commissioner of the Chicago DOT. You know, so it's
All
the
right,
MPO
all right.
policy committee is very much transportation people.
Right.
They advise the board and make recommendations to the board on transportation elements of the plan, on the policies, and on the programs. Ultimately, the board has that last decision.
Well, who bubbles stuff up from the 200 and? I'm sorry, Jaap, I just got to ask this question. This is a good question.
265
Sorry.
municipalities.
I'm sorry, I didn't see the red light. I ran right through it.
Yeah, 286
Well,
municipalities.
how does it bubble up through the? Because I'm thinking of a way if the MPO stayed together, they could bubble up some of the local stuff that's needed to the bigger board and.
So we have
I'm just-
11 councils of mayors,
11 councils. of
6 in Cook County and 5 in our collar counties, and
Collar
they're
County,
they're
gotcha.
so they're geographically based. They make recommendations on surface transportation program funds. So
okay.
we fund those out of our budget at CMAP. We fund those 11 councils of government.
Okay.
And so that's where they're our first contact on local government relations.
Okay.
They do 2 things. They do some transportation work, but as much as anything, they're our eyes and ears on the ground.
Well, that sounds like our MPOs now.
And maybe
to
what
some
you're-
extent.
yeah.
I mean, how they
I mean,
function.
Well, the truth is that all of my council of governments are bigger than any of your MPOs except Miami-Dade.
Okay.
You know, they're all 500,000 people plus.
Dang. All right.
All right, Mike, thank you.
All right.
I grabbed the mic because I want to at least give people an opportunity to ask. And I saw there was one hand.
I'm from Chicago, the suburbs, but I always say.
Everybody is always from Chicago.
New York.
It was interesting, Mr. Finley brought up the World Fair because I read the Windy City and it sounded like planning in Chicago and a sense of community really started with the World Fair. You know, the lakefront.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, that's where Daniel Burnham got his start.
Right,
And it went up through, you know, a lot of the important planning that was done when we were bidding for the Olympics.
Right.
It was very community-based. It didn't happen, but that planning, was done, and we were very much a part of that. So I interrupted your question, sorry.
I think the biggest issue is you mentioned mentioned that a county is not a region,
Yeah.
and I agree with you, but I don't think politically we could ever be Greater Miami, Greater Fort Lauderdale, or Greater Palm Beach, and being called South Florida is just a location, a geographic location. I think the business community and the people in South Florida might want to come up with a marketing strategy to be called Atlantic International, or some catchy phrase to give us a sense of community that, you know, maybe we can all identify with.
Metropica.
No, thank you.
No, I do think this is one of the serious issues that you all face is a lack of a regional identity. And that doesn't come easily, but you know, I can tell you it does come. I mean, over time, when Mayor Daley was still mayor, we had significantly awful suburban city relations over airports, over a whole bunch of issues, over water. You know, he brought people together and said, we are one region and we need to act like it, and we need to work together. So it's number one, it's about that leadership. But number two, it's about then, you know, identifying together about what you are and who you are. And it's going to be hard. You know, we are at least somewhat compact. I mean, you're hundreds of miles up and down a coast in a relatively narrow band. It doesn't lead itself necessarily to that center city and metropolitan thinking. But you have to find an identity, and there is one here. I'm not from here, so I don't know, but there has to be one, and you have to build on that to make sure that that's where people are thinking, and that's how people think about their community.
Earlier they said it was the sports complexes.
Yeah, and it's sports teams. You know, you can't be a Cub fan for this many years and not have a sense of identity.
Good transition. My name is Kevin. I'm not from Chicago. I'm from the Milwaukee area.
Ah, okay.
There you go. Bucks, Brewers, Packers. But
A suburb of Chicago.
I was fighting words for Sewer Pack. That's southeast Wisconsin, Regional Planning Council. My question or comment, I guess it ends up in a question, is I've been working in government for 21 years. 20 in local government. 1 year I've spent with a regional agency. And I have to say that your comment about a sense of urgency is what I'm after. In local government, there's always a crisis. There's always a sense of urgency. There's, you know, whether it's youth programs, the budget, labor relations, public safety, there's always something that's the important issue of the day. I don't sense that, or I didn't sense that, when I was in the regional agency. There was a recent example, I thought, though, where there was a sense of urgency with Amendment 4. We rallied. The state rallied. Everybody knew about it. And what we all thought was going to be a horrible experience, it got blown out of the water because of the education. And the local government was behind it. Everybody knew about it. So my question is, and Jim has left, but Jim said a few years ago that our local urgency for regional planning had to be jobs. I don't know if that's still the thought, that maybe it's jobs, jobs, jobs. That's the crisis that we rally around regionally. But the thought is, and thank you, Michael, for what you've just said about, or what the question you asked about 11 councils of mayors, because I think that's what has to happen. There has to be a synergy between local government and regional governance where it bubbles up and that they feel part of the process, funded through that. And I think the partnership with local government can help create that urgency. I just don't know what it is yet. So that's the question.
So Dan, when Tom, my communications guy, sent you the notes on this speech, wasn't the title "The Urgency of Long-Range Planning"? That's the way we like to talk about it. That we can't continue to not, in Illinois' case, it's not making bad decisions, it's making no decisions. We can't continue to not make decisions. And so I agree with you that there has to be a sense that there are urgent issues that have to be dealt with. I completely agree with that. The other piece is, again, in the geography side, it's the OECD, the Organization for Economic Competitiveness and Development, based out of Paris, just finished their first regional economic review, and it was the tri-state region of Chicago, Milwaukee, Chicago, Northwest Indiana. They said a lot of things, but one of the things that they came out with was, we need to think in an economic region, and it's not, and Milwaukee is part of it. and Milwaukee needs to want to be part of the Chicago economic region, and it doesn't always want to be. The other piece was that regional planning is where this is going to come together, because we are the only groups that think long terms and think across larger geographies. So, you know, they're throwing it a little bit back on us as to what's next as the regional agencies. But again, thinking about the geographies of these is, I will say again, don't get too caught up in it. Let it happen a little bit naturally and build on what grows.
All right, I want to thank Randy, and I want to
Thank
thank
you
our
very much.
panelists.